I think crafting in Solar Self-Found in Path of Exile 2 is great, much better than trade enjoyers make you believe perhaps, until it is not anymore, and then the flaws start to show. I feel I've played enough in Solar Self-Found to make a video about the topic, so let's dive in. Crafting in Path of Exile 2 has been brought back to a minimum, as already indicated by many other content creators. That is compared to Path of Exile 1, which is a logical comparison all things considered. To illustrate the consequences, I will take you on my own SSF progression journey in terms of crafting, highlighting where crafting really shines, all the way to where it basically falls off a cliff. During the campaign, crafting works quite well. While currently we don't get all of the crafting materials promised by Jonathan in various podcasts, it's not a complete drought either. It's just that a bit more materials per act would be a big improvement. You won't be able to craft rare items with 6 affixes on them, but I don't think you're supposed to either. However, crafting decent magic gear and from Act 2 or 3 onwards decent rare gear is very achievable, and the simplicity of the crafting system is purely an upside at this point. Crafting is intuitive, it is pretty obvious, you can melt down everything you find for crafting materials, and there are even quests for it to explain them to new players. And because the system is so straightforward, including the limited number of affixes on gear, it's not that hard to craft some fine gear with life, resistances, some spirit maybe, and some attributes. Things that most builds need. I would say overall in the campaign, crafting works and it allows you to gradually upgrade your gear so you don't fall too far behind. I expect some tuning of the material drop rates over time, making it only easier to craft in the future while you are running the campaign. In this video, I am less concerned about the amount of crafting materials dropping in the campaign because that ultimately doesn't determine if crafting is worth your time in SSF. If you would have access to an overabundance of crafting materials, but you don't see value in crafting using those materials, the amount of crafting materials that drop ultimately doesn't matter. So for now, I am simply assuming you have enough crafting materials available to you, and then I'm looking at the crafting itself and how useful it is. In my first playthrough in the campaign, my upgrades were a mix between items dropped from the ground as magic or rare, items crafted from scratch, and the occasional unique. It was a good mix overall, and one system didn't feel clearly superior in the campaign, meaning there was quite a nice balance. My situation when arriving at maps was that I am in complete rare gear. It was decent enough I suppose for a league start scenario in SSF, but I was not resistance capped and I definitely needed a few more attributes to use all my skills. That made the gear I needed to craft quite straightforward, and for the most part I crafted several pieces of decent gear from scratch, because a magic item with let's say 80 life and 20 fire resistance is an upgrade most likely in SSF. You use a regal orb plus a few exalted orbs if you have them, and there's your item. You pick up a bunch of generally decent bases, you drop plenty of augmentation and transmutation orbs, so creating these bases isn't a problem. Looking at the crafting sequence, or the act of crafting if you will, it's a rather short experience, because you either hit or you fail, and there are very few possibilities to fix items that bricked. It's incredibly binary. You either get a good affix or a bad one, and in case of a bad affix, you fairly quickly throw away the entire item. Especially in SSF, where crafting materials at this stage are still relatively scarce. The moment an item hits a bad affix, you are way less inclined to keep gambling, but rather recreate a decent base and start over. And yes, I think most of the crafting is very similar to gambling, unfortunately, but I will get to that aspect of crafting soon. At this stage of the game, in early maps, many pieces are an upgrade, and it is easy to create basic items with decent stats, meaning that crafting still feels like it is in a great spot, and it has definitely a place in the overall loot system in SSF. You get consistent upgrades and maybe start hunting for specific base items due to their implicit modifiers such as amethyst rings for chaos resistance or chest armors with spirit or mana regeneration. While you keep crafting, you do realize you are throwing away around 80 or 90% of what you craft, but the remaining 10 to 20% are worth your time because they are significant upgrades. I think once again that is a reasonable balance. It's worth mentioning that at this stage in the journey, you don't have access to any other form of crafting. Expedition crafting doesn't really exist at this point, as you simply are not interacting with Expedition all that much. Essences are incredibly unreliable and greater essences non-existent. Meta crafting using omens from ritual are perhaps even more rare than greater essences. Without investment in the ritual passive tree, and to get those points to invest, you need to get very lucky to find an audience with the king, also from ritual. I played for over 150 hours in endgame and I haven't found a single one. So all in all, the basic crafting materials available to you is all you have for crafting. It keeps it simple, which is the upside, but because it's just basic crafting materials at your disposal at the moment of writing, you will soon see the limitations of this system without any real substitutes like we have in Path of Exile 1. Which brings me to the end game. I reached a point where I have crafted a good number of pieces on my gear. I am resistance capped, I have full chaos resistance, a bunch of spirit for my minions, good energy shields. It's very decent gear all in all. I have cleared at this point all the tiers of maps. I'm running only high tier maps, and what you will start noticing is the lack of depth and control in the crafting system, especially in solo self-found. Using your currency for a trade isn't an option. That is sort of the point of SSF. It's around this time that I realized that using my currency for crafting, which is really what you're supposed to do in SSF, started making less and less sense, and there are a few reasons for that. First, I'll give you an example. Let's look at an intelligence-based helmet and imagine I found a good white base to craft on from scratch. Looking at the affixes on PoE.db, a website which lists all possible affixes, I would say that half of these prefixes and around 70% of the suffixes are good for my build. Life, energy shield, rarity if you count that, resistances, attributes, and plus level to minions. But as I'm already wearing gear, the lowest tiers of those prefixes and suffixes are not an upgrade. Weighing of affixes isn't currently known, but let's just give everything an equal weight for now, which means that everything has the same chance of being crafted. Doing a rough estimation, out of the 81 prefixes, meaning 8 different prefixes with on average 10 tiers per prefix, maybe 10 are usable, so that is 1 in 8 or 12.5%. For the suffixes, out of the 82 possible outcomes, let's be generous and say 20 are good ones, so the high tier attributes, resistances, etc. That is 1 in 4 or 25%. Assuming equal weighting for the sake of the argument, the odds of creating a magic item from scratch with one good prefix and one good suffix is 12.5% times 25%, or 12.5% divided by 4, meaning roughly 3%. That means you have to create around 30 items using a transmutation and augmentation orb in order to get a magic item with just 2 good modifiers, and then you only have the base. This is a bit of napkin math, but it is very much like this in game. At this stage, once you have already decent rare gear, it takes seemingly ages to get decent base items to get 2 affixes. After that, you are using a regal orb because greater essences are non-existent, and even if they were, they don't guarantee a high tier roll. And that regal orb has the same low odds. I think you start seeing the issue just looking at the modifier list, and that issue is the time it takes to create a rare item with, let's say, only 4 good affixes in SSF. Starting from scratch is incredibly long. And I'm including the time to pick up all those bases, craft on them, look at them, vendor them, and store them, and then continue crafting, etc. All that time spent, you could be killing monsters in maps and pick up tiered rare items instead. The second point, related to the first, is the lack of control in crafting. Using basic essences and basic crafting materials, so effectively your essence and currency tab, you notice after a while that you have zero control on the outcome. The only deterministic part of a craft is the rune that you put in the socket, which has basically nothing to do with crafting and can't even be removed once you put it there. The rest is completely up to chance, and the absence of essences like they worked in Path of Exile 1, guaranteeing an affix of a certain tier, plus the absence of a crafting bench, which also guaranteed an affix, plus the absence of fracturing or synthesized items, means literally the whole crafting process using these crafting materials is RNG, which is a big problem because once you reach the point where the odds of crafting an upgrade are so low due to the lack of any deterministic step in the crafting process, you simply stop crafting. At least I did, because it feels just pointless and a waste of time. Which is a shame, because up to that point it is quite fun, straightforward, intuitive and engaging. And I want to emphasize here that I think up to this point crafting works quite well in SSF because your gear is generally speaking less strong compared to trade, increasing the value of crafting gear yourself. But at a certain stage, which is pretty far into endgame, crafting simply falls off a cliff. This is a huge problem with crafting currently, the lack of deterministic outcomes, leaving us with basically a complete RNG implementation that you will reach a point in endgame where you stop crafting entirely and just start to rely on finding a good rare, which you then slam twice with an exalted orb and that's it. I'm aware that if you're using omens, you have more control over crafting, but in Solo Self-Found you simply don't find these omens. I've been doing a lot of rituals, but I don't get the passive points so far. I can imagine that if those materials become more balanced and available, SSF crafting starts to become viable again in late endgame, but at this moment in time, it's really not. Another honorable mention is expedition crafting. You do get plenty of materials, I feel, and also getting the passive points isn't all that difficult. The balance there is in a good place, I would say, but the crafting itself is quite unrewarding. The crafting process got nerfed to around only 5 steps, where previously you could interact around 8 times with ROG in Path of Exile 1. This is clearly a big difference, and having 8 opportunities to create an item instead of 5 clearly increases the chances of a good outcome. Despite that, I did find some ways to create upgrades, primarily by making sure you pick a good base, but after that you have to get lucky. I did create this fabulous amulet, however, so it is hard to say that crafting in Expedition is useless, but I do feel Expedition crafting suffers from the same issues as regular crafting, and that is the lack of determinism in the process. It feels like gambling rather than a process you have any influence on due to the limited number of steps, and I don't think that is the state that crafting should be in. Let's draw a conclusion. Crafting in Solo Self-Found is mostly great and useful, I think, all the way until the late endgame. But then at that point it's not, because the time spent crafting simply doesn't feel like a worthwhile investment anymore. Which is a shame, because it reduces the loot game to strictly finding items with tiers on them, like a tier 5 belt, in order to progress gear in a meaningful way. I think with the addition of more crafting methods and maybe some tweaking of the availability of crafting materials that are already in the game, like omens, this situation can be much better and can even be resolved. Until then, I'm running a super tight loot filter and I'm just blasting maps, looking for the occasional energy shield base with tiers on them. I hope you had a good time watching this video. Let me know what you think and let me know your thoughts on crafting in SSF. Also let me know if you have any suggestions for future content. Subscribe and like for more PoE SSF content. Thanks for watching and making it to the end. Love you all, see you soon, bye bye.